Good afternoon, and welcome to the Human Microbiome Podcast with Tom Walsh. In this episode, we talk to Jim Levoy from Irvine, California. Jim suffered for almost a year with an antibiotic-resistant bacteria called Clostridium Difficile, or C. diff for short. But Jim's story starts with being infected with a different bug during a business trip in Japan. After finding out that a relative had died, he had to return to his hometown in Michigan. And on the flight home, he starts getting sick. Real sick.
I got into Detroit. I got to my mom's house, and I remember I was shaking like I couldn't control my hands. I was shaking really bad, so I just went up to my room, and I was freezing my ass off. So I went and grabbed every blanket I could in all of the rooms and stuck it on the bed, and I slept for 2 days just to get out of bed. My system completely failed, and everything, any bit of food I had just went right through me. I wasn't absorbing any kind of nutrients for quite some time. I lost 7 to 10 pounds that first 3 or 4 days, and then when I got back to California, that's when the doctor just loaded me up on the antibiotics, and that seemed to get things back to sort of normal. But then within a month or so, I picked up the other goddamn thing, and then that's what just lasted for the longest time.
The heavy dose of antibiotics prescribed by Jim's doctor seems to have killed off the vicious bug. But they also caused him to get sick with the second bug, C. diff. We don't know if it was laying low in Jim before his first infection, or if it infected him at the doctor's office. What we do know is that in the absence of good bacteria that were killed in the collateral damage from the antibiotics, C. diff started to rapidly colonize his gut. Compared to the first infection, his symptoms are tolerable, but they won't go away.
It was just bad diarrhea on a pretty frequent basis, and you could feel you weren't absorbing any nutrients. It's kind of like your body's just weak. It controlled my days sometimes. I had to be strategic thinking about, being in meetings. Like, okay, is this going to hit me? And there was a few times I just had to get up and, go to the restroom. I wasn't going to try to hold on because that just felt miserable.
For months, Jim's doctor doesn't know what he has and keeps giving him standard antibiotics. But because of its resistance, C. diff keeps coming back while the good bugs keep getting wiped out. When his doctor finally identifies the infection, he decides to give him Difficile, a very powerful antibiotic designed specifically for C. diff. There's just one problem.
The insurance company wouldn't pay for it. Those fucking pills were, I forget what they, $200 a pill or something like that. It was a lot of money for those things. They wanted to give some kind of, whatever the generic equivalent was, and the doc said, this one you got to get the real thing. The equivalent was similar to some of the other stuff I had already taken. Initially they balked, but he wrote some note, and I talked to them, and they ended up agreeing. I mean, at the end of the day, it probably cost them less money.
In addition to getting his insurance to approve the antibiotics, Jim's doctor gives him some crucial advice.
When he gave me that antibiotic, he was saying you got to load up on the probiotics at the same time. Philip's colon health was what I started swallowing because he was worried about just killing all of the good bacteria along with whatever was bad in there.
Suffering with C. diff for almost an entire year taught Jim a hard lesson about antibiotics and probiotics.
And before I did this, I was totally an antibiotic guy. If something was wrong, I'd ask the doctor, well, just give me the antibiotics, and I'll take it just in case. Now, after going through that process, I'd never do that. And then I remember watching those probiotic commercials, and I thought, it stuck in my head, I think it was Jamie Lee Curtis who did some probiotics. So I thought probiotics was basically for overweight or old women. I would never need anything like that. And then, now I'm sucking those pills down. I could take 2 every day just to be sure.
It's been over a year since he was cured of the C. diff, but he doesn't feel like he's fully recovered.
I bet I'm not 100%. I've never felt completely back to normal, and my stomach every once in a while just is that reoccurring kind of feel, but it's never as severe as it was when I was sick.
Jim might have been better off with an alternative treatment. At some point, his doctor recommended a stool transplant, a procedure as effective as it is funny or gross.
It was an option that was discussed, but because of the progression of where I wasn't getting better, and I said, who the hell's I can't imagine donating this, and he kind of laughed and told me, yeah, people go and donate it, they got to make sure that they're okay and all that kind of stuff. But there's no doubt at the time, if I would have relapsed or if I was on the path going down, I'd do anything to try to fix it.
Many studies show that stool transplants work better than antibiotics for C. diff, and it cures between 80 to 90% of patients. Would Jim have been better off if he received one as soon as he was diagnosed? Thanks for listening to the Human Microbiome Podcast. This is Tom Walsh signing off.